This week, Dirtbag Billionaire. Cheryl Bronstein of Passage Bookstore in Corte Madera, California, introduces the discussion.
Meet Dirtbag Billionaire, the story of someone who literally slept in the dirt, went on to own a global apparel empire, and then decided that, yep, giving it all away sounded like a good idea, a good retirement plan, a good way to move forward. This is not your typical rags to riches tale, unless those rags include tattered backpacks and stained fleece vests. And the riches don't stop at the balance sheet. Dirtbag Billionaire dives into delicious contradictions of a man who built a multi-billion-dollar brand while wrestling with how to remain true to his idealism in a marketplace that worships excess. The book emphasizes tension between ideals like government activism, social responsibility, and the realities of running a business, like using synthetic materials, grappling with leadership and staff issues. Dirtbag Billionaire is a corporate drama, but this is not your ticket. This is not to the boardroom. This is your ticket into the wilderness. Now today, all profits from Patagonia are committed to environmental causes. David Gellis is an award-winning correspondent for the New York Times. He currently writes for Climate Desk and previously wrote for the business section and was the corner office columnist. His book, The Man Who Broke Capitalism, was an instant New York Times bestseller. Tonight, David is joined on stage by Paul Lightfoot. Paul is the general manager of Patagonia Provisions, Patagonia's food and beverage division. Provision brings market foods that help fight environmental crisis. And he is also chair of the board of the Regenerative Organic Alliance, which is a revolutionary new label for food, fiber, botanical ingredients, and products. So we're glad to have both of them here. We are always honored and delighted to have great minds on our humble Marin County stage. We thank David and Paul for making their way to Marin County today to share their work with us this evening. Now it is my great honor, so please give a very warm welcome to this talented duo, David Gellis and Paul Lightfoot.
And David, we'll start with like the easiest, or maybe not the easiest, but the simplest of questions. Why did you write this book? Why did you feel like the world needed this book?
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. And it's super fun to be. I was hoping you were going to not leave me hanging here, brother. Cheers. That's good, isn't it? It's really good. Yeah. It's like a crazy thing to write a book. I think I would make more money on an hourly basis driving an Uber, because it's just thousands and thousands and thousands of hours, and it consumes like so much of my waking energy when I'm working on a project like this. And so the reason why I did it is because I had to. And the reason I had to is because for whatever combination of cosmic reasons, I'm a reporter who cares about business and cares about how business can be a force for good in addition to how it can mess things up. I've covered both sides of the ledger. And this particular book had its sort of immediate genesis 3 years ago when I broke the news for the New York Times that Chouinard was giving away the company. And at that moment, I understood almost immediately that I was going to write a book about this company and this story for a few reasons. Number one, that story is the single most viewed piece of writing I will probably ever write in my life. It went truly viral in a way that very few articles do these days. That year, it was, I think, the third most visited URL on the New York Times after the Trump taxes story and the live blog of the Queen's death. And so what that said to me is that there was deep appetite for this story. People were hungry to understand what had happened and to engage with Chouinard's story and the story of Patagonia. And it was also clear to me that I needed to do this because I had thought about writing this book for 7 years. Even before I wrote my previous book, The Man Who Broke Capitalism, which is all about how Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric, sort of messed up American society, in my contention, I had thought about writing a book about Yvon Chouinard's friendship with Doug Tompkins, a pivotal character in the book. And I didn't write that book for a number of reasons, but in part, I didn't write it because there was no third act. There was no way to end the story in a satisfactory way. But then in 2022, when he had given away the company, you could sort of see how Yvon's life was going to resolve. You could see where the company was going. And I had my third act, if you will. And then I just went and did it.
Fascinating. You mentioned that story in 2022. I had joined Patagonia half a year before that. So I heard about David before I met you, in that the woman who runs communications for us said, we trust one person in the world. And when this story comes out on September 22nd, I think, of 2022, it'll be written by David. And I remember thinking, well, that's interesting. What did you do to gain the trust of the company? And Patagonia is a company that doesn't typically chase media coverage. Yvon says no to every invitation. I mean, unless it's really, every award, everything, unless it's a really beautiful fishing opportunity, he says no. No, that's not a joke, right? Why did you gain that trust? What happened?
I first met Yvon Chouinard almost 15 years ago when I was researching my first book, which was called Mindful Work. And it was all about how meditation and mindfulness were showing up in the business world. And quick to add here, Yvon Chouinard is not a Buddhist. He's not even really a meditator. But I had read over the years that he had an interest in Zen. And he was drawn to the simplicity of Zen, to the idea of being in the moment. I think that's something that really he understood at an intuitive level from his time in the wilderness in particular. As a designer and as a product designer, I think he loved the idea in Zen of taking things away rather than adding. And so I came to Patagonia 15 years ago, and he was generous. He spent sort of a half day with me, and I have all these vivid memories of our first meeting, and I included a little bit of that in the book. And then fast forward a few years, I'm the guy at the Times during the first Trump administration that is tasked with covering corporate America's response to the White House and to President Trump's actions. And so I write about the dissolution of the business councils. I write about the corporate response to Charlottesville. And I also write about a lawsuit that Patagonia files in 2017 suing President Trump, suing his administration.
The suit is ongoing still.
It's revived once again. And it was extraordinary that this little brand in Southern California, like what business did it have doing? But here it was suing the administration over its efforts to reduce the size of some national monuments. That was a big, thorny story. I talked to Yvon again for it. And then in the years after that, I continued covering the company for the Times, including efforts to get out the vote. I interviewed a series of CEOs for the column I was writing at the time, Corner Office. And then, in early 2022, Corley, the communications and policy lead for the company, she called me. She said, I've got a big story for you. I said, what is it? She said, I can't tell you. And so I called her back a month later. I was like, what's the big story? She said, I can't tell you. And we played this game for 6 months, really, all year. And then finally, I remember where I was standing when she finally explained to me what was happening. And I was like, oh, that's a big deal. Tell it to me again so I really make sure I understand it, because it's complicated. And she told me to again. And then, boom, after that, I just knew it was going to be a massive story.
You may as well tell the story, what the story was then.
So I have to get like a little technical if we want to really get into it. So Patagonia is a privately held corporation. And one of the extraordinary things about the story of this company, just from a corporate perspective, is Yvon Chouinard bootstrapped the whole thing, to use sort of business parlance. He never accepted any outside capital. He never raised money, not from venture capital, not from friends and family, not from private equity. He never took it public. And as a result, in 2022, 50 years into this company's history, he, his wife, and their 2 children owned 100% of the shares of this company. 2% of those were voting shares, 98% were non-voting shares. And what they did after a lot of deliberation, which I describe in detail in the book, was in 2022, they took the 2% of the voting shares, they put them in a new entity called the Patagonia Purpose Trust, which is a legal vehicle in California. They paid $17.5 million for the privilege of putting that 2% into the Purpose Trust. The Purpose Trust now sits on top of Patagonia Inc., the for-profit company, almost like an additional board layer or governance layer. They took the other 98% of the non-voting shares. They put those into a series of 501c4 nonprofit corporations. And now here's how it works. The Patagonia Purpose Trust, as a director essentially, instructs Patagonia Inc., the for-profit corporation, to donate 100% of the profits not reinvested into the company, not used for payroll and operations and R&D, out the door to the 501c4 corporations, which then distribute those monies on an ongoing basis to the causes that Chouinard and his family have always cared about most, namely large-scale land conservation and environmental activism. And so that's the story that I broke in the Times. And it was big and thorny and complicated, and we can get into any of the details, including the fact that a lot of people were very suspicious of his motivations. But that was a transformative transaction. As someone who's covered corporate America for decades now, I knew the first time I heard it that this was a big deal because nothing like this had ever been done before. And I knew from my work that this was a seminal event in the history of corporate America.
I'm going to switch gears. When I was recruited to join Patagonia, it was about 4 years ago, I immediately said yes. At the end of every interview, I said, I'll go. Like, I'll move my whole family. And there's a handful of Patagonia people here, some over here, some over here. You may have all felt similar, like when you got recruited, you wanted to go. You mentioned that you'd always wanted to write this book. Patagonia's not that big of a company. It's a very small share of the economy, even a very small share of the apparel business, not even close to the biggest outdoor company. What is it about Patagonia? Why do people feel compelled by it?
This was one of the answer to that question revealed itself over time through the reporting of this book. And if you had asked me that question, I think 3 years ago, I wouldn't have had a full or satisfactory answer. But the way I've come to understand it, and I'll talk about the specific things that I think people are responding to, and maybe I'll just preview them here. It's the company's long-standing but not terribly well-known commitment to childcare, the extraordinary ways it's elevated working women in the corporate structure and really allowed them to flourish and prosper and lead. It's their efforts to clean up their own supply chain in a really deep and committed way. It's the efforts to help bring other companies along. It's the commitment to not just its supply chain, but to developing cleaner materials. And so all these things, which we can get into in detail, are again, not terribly well understood by the average consumer, but I think there's an understanding more broadly that Patagonia sort of stands for this. But the reason all that has happened is because Chouinard and the team and his family, they understood what they cared about 50 years ago, and they never took their eye off the ball. It has been this half-century journey of staying true to their values, to the same things they believed in 1973 when they founded the company. Yeah. And as much as it is any of those individual programs, I think it's that sort of consistency and authenticity that people are responding to when they engage with the Patagonia brand, which, to your point, is regarded universally, objectively, as one of the most powerful brands in the country. The Axios Harris poll puts it as the most trusted brand in the country. It was, well, you fella who took over?
Trader Joe's.
Okay. Yeah. No comment. I won't go there. We can talk about Trader Joe's at the bar.
Same.
Read your ingredient labels.
I'm still not making a comment. So,
So I think that's a big part of it.
yeah. So when we think about what Patagonia, it punches above its weight, what does it have to say to the world? And you've heard me make the joke that people often say to me, especially growth stage companies, how can I make my business more like Patagonia? And I used to joke, start 50 years ago and don't raise money from outside investors because they'll bring this short-termism to the table. When I read your book, it revealed more things that I don't see that easily being on the inside. It was really helpful to me. But maybe share what you saw about Patagonia that was unique that you think is useful for other companies to imagine emulating.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, but I want you to go just a little deeper here. I mean, I don't take for granted the fact that we have a senior Patagonia exec as my interlocutor right here. So say how a bit more about how your own understanding of that answer changed.
Yeah. David is a world-class interviewer, so he's slumming it. He's slumming it sitting next to me right now. I did always sort of make that joke about start 50 years ago, and I don't have it memorized, but I actually made a list of 10 things while I was reading the book because it really did show the company and my experience to me differently. I think the most important thing that I really came to realize that we do, and this is my colleague Christy does this all the time, we never stop asking about our supply chains and where things come from. And we try never to not feel accountable for all of the implications and consequences of all of those things. So the story, the cotton story in the book was I don't know that I'd quite made the connection that I'm here because of that cotton experience.
Yeah.
That's why we're in food, even though no one says that. It's clearly this through line from conventional cotton to learning about agriculture to realizing that it was fucked to deciding to do.
We're on C-SPAN, Paul. You can't use that word.
It's not like that anymore, David.
No comment.
So for me, it's what I think everyone should do in their companies is what Yvon, I think, did from the beginning, and he's drummed it into all of us, culturally drummed it into all of us, is where did this thing come from? How was it made? And what are the consequences of it? And I think that so much of what's wrong in corporate America is that part missing.
I forget what your original question was.
What did you learn about Patagonia that you think is useful for other companies?
Yeah. No, I say this in the introduction, I think. No one can recreate Chouinard's life. And I know we're talking a lot about the company here, and that's appropriate. But he also had a crazy life. Yeah. I mean, the things he did as a climber and as an adventurer, he crammed many, many lives, many, many lifetimes into just a few decades. I mean, extraordinary. And I think you talk about consistency and authenticity. That's also what people are responding to when they respond to Patagonia. I think that's what employees at the company respond to. They know this guy was the real deal, and he modeled a behavior that people are still trying to emulate today. So in the same way that no one can snap their fingers and become Yvon Chouinard, no company can snap their fingers, to your point, and become Patagonia. What instead I've come to realize is, though, all of us can make choices. And the story of Patagonia is not of one extraordinary moment that Chouinard did that changed the trajectory and sort of created everything we're talking about here. The story is all these little choices, time and time again, being confronted with something like organic cotton, and maybe I'll just tell that story because you referenced it, and deciding that that was something that they cared about. Figuring out that they were in a financial pinch and they had to make a very difficult decision, and how were they going to navigate it in a way that was true to their values. Figuring out that suddenly Chouinard family had a bunch of money. What were they going to do with that money? Were they going to buy a bigger house? Were they going to go buy a yacht? No, they were going to give it away to conservation. And so this book is not one big moment and then the aftermath of that moment.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
The book is all these little moments. And that's something every company goes through every day. I mean, I know there are CEOs in the room here that are running their own companies that are trying to figure out with every little moment, every little decision, every little business problem, how to stay true to their own values. And so I'll just, the organic cotton story is instructive here. In 1988, Patagonia was growing fast. They were doing, tens or maybe even close to $100 million plus in business at this time. They were opening a new store in Boston. They had stocked the walls with inventory, all brand new clothes, ready to be sold on Newbury Street, ready to go. And in the days before the grand opening, everyone in that building started getting sick. People were coughing, wheezing. Something was in the air, something bad. They brought in some specialists to identify the source of whatever contamination was there. And they discovered it was the T-shirts that were sitting on the shelves. The conventional cotton that was in those T-shirts had been treated with formaldehyde. And everyone was getting sick. And that set the Patagonia team and ultimately Chouinard on this journey of trying to understand, wait, why does our clothing have formaldehyde on it? And what else is going on? And they ultimately, in pretty short order, started making trips to the Central Valley right here. And they started going and looking at conventional cotton farms. And what they saw appalled them because these fields were dead of insects. There was no ecological diversity. There was waste. There were pesticide pools. It was nasty business. And when Chouinard himself got on a bus and took one of these tours, he came back and he told his team, we're not going to use conventional cotton anymore. And his team said, excuse me, boss, that's going to cost 40% of revenue next year. And he said, great, figure it out. And if you can't figure it out, we'll lose a bunch of business. And there's the moment I'm talking about, right? He understood what he cared about. He had his values. And faced with a really tough decision, he was unwavering. And it's important to note here, he had the freedom to do that because of something we talked about earlier, which is the fact that he owned the whole company. And I don't want to take that for granted. So it's not simple. Other companies have all sorts of complexities and constraints. But at the end of the day, his ability to not sweep it aside, not say, okay, we'll phase it out over 10 years as we build up the organic cotton supply chain. Instead, to make a really clear values-based decision, that's the kind of decision that is still getting made today. I mean, it happened recently when Patagonia got clear that its rain-proof vests and shells had PFAS. Yeah. They've been on a journey in recent years to get PFAS out, and it wasn't clear that they were going to do it. And there was a moment, I've talked to people inside the company that were like, we might have to stop selling waterproof gear. Yeah. That would be hard for Patagonia, but they were ready to do it if they couldn't figure it out.
Yvon meant it then as well. You mentioned the Axios Harris poll. So Patagonia is pretty often ranked near the top of that poll, and the analysts come in once a year and explain what happened, and it's always that. It's the companies near the top are companies that put their values ahead of their financial interest consistently, and not the same values. Like Chick-fil-A's values are we close on Sunday because of religious reasons. That really lands with the people that love that brand, right? So it tends to be that. Let's stay on this idea of other businesses. There are so many businesses, some that we interact with or at least know about, whose business models have different values. There's business models where you're sort of ruining your customers' lives, where you're pouring chemicals in the river behind the factory, right? And I guess Patagonia's not perfect. We'll talk about that as well. Patagonia makes mistakes. Patagonia is filled with humans. But it feels like it's always trying to do the right thing, the responsible thing. How do we get that not to be worth writing a book about?
I mean, listen, here I'm quick to remind people that I'm not an evangelist. I'm a reporter. And I guess what I've seen in all my years of reporting is that it's really hard. It is really hard, especially, as you alluded to earlier, for established public companies, which are oftentimes the big actors. And I can't tell you how many stories I've written about brand name companies that went on some sustainability journey, and there was a mission-driven CEO and a board that was aligned with this vision, and 7 years later, new CEO comes in, new board shows up, a lot of that work goes out the door. So I'm not naive in thinking that if only, more people and more executives read this book, and they should all read the book, that we would magically fix all these problems. I think you mentioned an important point, which is incentive structures. And there again, we have big, intractable problems. Like the public markets are not incentivized to optimize for this kind of behavior. That's just not how it's structured.
Short-termism.
And so I think what you need to do if you're at another company, you're trying to have these conversations, is figure out how to make headway on some of these values-based issues, whatever those values might be, while also still delivering great product. And that's something I consistently heard from Chouinard and every other senior executive at the company. The line that I think in 2017-18 they said was, "We're in business to save the home planet." But the first couple words of that is like, we're in business. And one of the rougher edges I came across in reporting this book was that there were times when margins started to slip, and Chouinard was not a sympathetic manager at that point. He was never much of a manager at all, but as the owner, I guess I could say, he didn't like to see it. And he reminded people, and he was hard-ass at times, that he expected roughly 10% margins, that's real for the apparel business. That's good. And when that fell off, people heard from him, and there were consequences. So I think that idea of knowing what your values are, but understanding that alone isn't going to carry the day. You got to deliver a great product. You got to deliver great services. You got to deliver consistency and great customer service. And if you do all that, you sort of earn the right to do all the rest of it.
That's right. So 2 weeks ago was Climate Week. David hosted a day, Climate Forward, I believe it was called, at the New York Times Center. And Gavin Newsom was interviewed by David. And then right after that, the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, who I'm pretty sure lives on a different planet than all the people here. Since I'm on C-SPAN, I just want to make it clear that I thought he was crazy. How can this audience sort of jive their values and experience with that sort of craziness in the world? He made it clear that Trump would be the best president for climate in history.
I think the direct quote was, 5 years from now, we will all be giving President Trump the Champion of the Climate Award.
I can't wait. How do we square that circle?
It's not squareable. No, but this is. I'll come back to that. But at the heart of this book is a big paradox. I think I say something like this in the introduction. I'm like, a lot of business books offer like pat insights for getting ahead. This is not one of them. Right? This is like a Zen koan. This is all questions and no tidy answers. And that's the world we live in. Right? I heard this. The Newsom interview I did, followed by the Energy Secretary Wright interview I did, it was not split screen. It was alternate universes.
Yeah, it was.
It was extraordinary to hear these completely different interpretations of the world we live in,
of reality,
the impact that the burning of fossil fuels and agriculture is having on the planet, the risks associated with that, and what we should do. I mean, they could not have been more different. And the reality is, there's a lot of good work being done in the world, and I write about that a lot. And the reality is also, we have an administration that is trying to stymie the growth of renewable energy in this country and promote fossil fuels and take us back to the early 20th century in terms of our energy infrastructure. So all that's true at the same time, and that's the complexity. That's the paradox.
So you cover both companies and the federal government, all governments, I guess, in your role as leading the climate reporting work at the New York Times.
The beer's kicking in, so
Good.
Wherever you want to go.
The federal government is essentially dropping out of the race, dropping out of the fight in climate, right? Do you think that corporations have a larger responsibility now? Do you think that they're stepping up to it? And how do you think that'll evolve?
So here I hasten to add, and I don't mean this as a cop-out, like it's not my role. I'm not a evangelist for corporate action. I'm a reporter. I get a little more pointed when I do my book work, but that's not ultimately what this book is about. Yeah. I mean, I can say I admire a lot about Patagonia and what it stands for, even as I acknowledge it's not perfect, but I'm not here telling every other company to be like Patagonia. That's not what this is. I will, however, address some of the other questions you just added there, which is like, how is the corporate world showing up in this moment?
Yeah.
And I have a lot of authority to talk about that because, as I mentioned earlier, I was the reporter at the Times who really covered the corporate response to Trump 1. And back then, I couldn't keep up with the news. Every day, CEOs were tweeting. Every day, Patagonia was filing a lawsuit. Corporations were pulling out of White House appearances. Every single day, corporate actors were standing up and saying, this is not the world we want to be a part of. This is not an administration we support. This is not the America we want to do business in.
I'm feeling nostalgia.
Yeah, there's a big but coming here, right? It's crickets today. Oh. And in fact, many of these same CEOs that spoke up on the record against the first Trump administration are literally standing next to the president, sitting across from him at state dinners today. And so whether or not the corporate world has a responsibility, and I would direct you to the work of someone like Barbara Walters, who wrote a book called How Civil Wars Start, who talks a lot about the role of businesses in preventing a slide to autocracy. She would contend that businesses absolutely have a play to role. She would contend that in Brazil, it's what brought the country back from the brink. The fact that the business world stood up and said, this isn't going to work for us. And it was the acquiescence of the business world in a country like Hungary that allowed things to go so far in the other direction.
Yeah. I certainly think businesses have a role to play. You were honest and direct in the book about ways Patagonia wasn't perfect. You want to just maybe share a little bit about that?
I mean, hold up the mirror, bud.
The rest of the business.
Yeah, I don't want to rattle off all the ways in which I think Patagonia is imperfect. So that's that kind of framing, like how does Patagonia suck, doesn't feel great. Instead, maybe I'll come back to this idea of contradictions and tensions, which is to say, Chouinard and his family and the leadership team, as I've referenced, they cared about conservation. They cared about protecting the planet. How did they make the money to do that? By producing apparel that takes a huge toll on the planet. You can call that a paradox. You can call that creative tension. You can call it hypocrisy. Right? There's deep hypocrisy embedded in this. You can point to the fact that Yvon Chouinard's book was called Let My People Go Surfing. And indeed, there was a moment at the company when you could go catch the waves if the surf was up. That company runs a little different today, as I don't need to tell you. Maybe some people are still surfing, but a lot of people are working really hard. And in fact, a lot of them are working hard and never getting any equity. And one of the surprising things I came across in all my conversations is that, yes, Patagonia employees are often paid well and maybe even above market rate. But you talk to some old timers who spent decades there, and when they're candid, they'll say they're a little frustrated. They didn't come away with a little more. And you can say that's a bummer. But you can also say that's consistency, because Chouinard himself never cared about maximizing his own earnings. So you sort of knew who you were working for. And so these tensions, these paradoxes are all over the place. And I'll just add one more, which gets to maybe some of the more direct ways in which Patagonia is not like a model for all other companies. This is a company that somehow miraculously has survived 50 plus years and continues to grow. Could have always grown every single year of its existence. It probably could have grown more than it did. But along the way, it developed a completely chaotic, unruly culture in which like traditional management practices were like just anathema to the way the place ran. And so GE, the company I wrote about in my previous book, I contend they had a really negative impact on the world. But I'll freely...
So great management.
Amazing management. Incredible. There's a reason everyone went and hired Jack Welch. They knew how to run a big organization. It's sort of the inverse here. I think Patagonia's actually had a very positive impact on the world in a lot of ways. And absolutely chaotic management. I mean, no one goes to Patagonia to like hire the next great organizational leader, my friend.
We're going to move on to the next question. And I'm going to wrap up my questions in a minute so we can take questions from anyone who has any. This is another sort of paradox kind of, or at least a conflict kind of question. Yvon's best friend was Doug Tompkins, who was a Bay Area guy, and he founded the North Face a long time ago, and then much larger, because he sold North Face very, very early, Esprit, made a lot of money, didn't feel great necessarily about the impact Esprit was having on the world, but made amazing impact with the money that he took out of it. And he used to always say, I believe I read in your book, to Yvon, sell the company for a pile of money and let's do this together. And Yvon disagreed. So maybe walk the audience through that disagreement and whether you think one of them was on the right path or not.
Yeah. I mean, it's a friendship that's like present on almost every page of the book. And it's an extraordinary story of a community of friends and individuals and ultimately family members that went on this journey together. And I'll just note that, Doug, as you said, founded both the North Face and the Esprit. And Yvon Chouinard, of course, founded Patagonia, but he also founded the company that's now Black Diamond. And so you think about it, two men founded 4 companies that have lasted 50 years and have fundamentally changed the world. It's amazing when you look at their legacies, both in retail and conservation. So as you alluded to, by the late 90s, Doug Tompkins had enough. And he had enough with materialism because he did embrace the finer things in life, whereas Chouinard always resisted him. But he also had enough with like running a business. He was just done. So he sold his share, took hundreds of millions of dollars, moved to South America, and started buying up land. Over the next 20 years or so, he and his wife, Chris McDivitt Tompkins, who is another huge character in the book, she was the CEO of Patagonia for many years before falling in love with Doug, joining him on this conservation effort. They bought, and again, this has not been widely reported, but I get into it in the book, with the support of the Chouinards in a huge way, millions of acres in South America, and have turned those lands over to the governments of Chile and Argentina to make a series of national parks. And it's a remarkable act of land conservation and environmental stewardship. Chouinard could have done that and much more. At one point, Melinda Chouinard, his wife, told me that they had an offer on the table for $6 billion cash. That buys a lot of land. And they said no. And they said no for a couple reasons. Number one, Yvon didn't want to lose control of the company. But he also believed that Patagonia had a role to play as an ongoing concern. And in the same way that he never really sweated about maximizing his own net worth, he never thought about optimizing. We're all obsessed with like efficiency, optimization, and maximizing our impact. That's just not how he thinks. I really know this after spending time with him. And so in his mind, it was worth that trade-off to maybe have less immediate, large-scale impact on whatever his causes might be, and instead preserve Patagonia as the weird, funky, imperfect, but impactful company that it is, so it can serve as a model for the rest of the corporation.
And I'm sure glad you did.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
I'm going to open up to questions. We didn't look at any sort of run a show. What time are we supposed to shift to?
I think we have like 12 minutes of Q&A.
And are we going to do a book signing then? Okay.
I'll sign some books.
And you have a microphone. So we'll start at the back.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. Since C-SPAN is filming, so we're going to have you speak into the mic.
I think it's so interesting that you wrote back-to-back books on Jack Welch and Yvon Chouinard. And I wonder if I think about Jack Welch and Delaware law, only focus on maximizing shareholder value, and then financial engineering, everything that went with that, and put aside employees, community, suppliers, everything else. And Patagonia has not done that, but you can't bootstrap every company out there in the world. And so I'm wondering, how do you go back to changing the law in Delaware, the law in other places, so that we can take into account the broader constituencies and have a much more balanced set of companies out there?
Yeah, well, first thing I'd do is note that the law in Delaware actually doesn't say that. There's no law that actually says companies have to maximize short-term profits at the expense of every other concern. Like, that is a myth that has been created by disciples of Milton Friedman to excuse bad behavior. So let's start by calling that truth out. But the truth is, at the same time, it's really hard. And even if that is not the case, the stock market and activist investors and like the pension funds that steward a lot of our retirement dollars make decisions that tend to optimize for that kind of behavior, tend to optimize for maximizing short-term earnings. And so, listen, there's no easy solutions. And I mean, we're almost talking about my previous book at this point, but what I describe in the Man Who Broke Capitalism is really a 70-year journey from what was known as the golden age of American capitalism, the post-war years, where companies really believed that their responsibility was not to their shareholders, but was to their employees, to their communities, to their suppliers. And I cite in that book the 1953 General Electric annual report, which proudly talked about it. It was the best year in the company's history. They made the most money revenues, most profits, and they said, we're so proud of this year because we paid our employees the most ever. We paid our suppliers the most ever. We had the biggest payroll we've ever had, most people on the payroll. And we paid the most taxes we've ever paid. And that's a great thing. And the last thing on the list was, and we returned 1% to shareholders. It took 70 years to get from there to where we are today. And if we are going to get back somewhere closer to there, it's going to be a multi-generational project as well. So there's no quick fixes to this stuff. But I do think like companies like Patagonia, they can help. And I'll just note, I'm going to be a little careful here, but over the last few weeks since I've been on the road talking about this book, I've had conversations with really big corporations. There are massive multinationals who you see their logo every day that are trying to understand how they can get better, trying to think about how they can show up in a better way. And this book is an opportunity for them to have some of those conversations in sort of a non-threatening way, because it's not about them. And that gives me hope. The fact that some of the biggest brands in America are asking tough questions of themselves is a start.
I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Billionaire Who Wasn't, about Chuck Feeney at Duty Free Shoppers, who also gave away his fortune and actually inspired Warren Buffett and Bill Gates to start the whole pledge towards giving away their fortunes. And, that was written in 2013. And I see the traction that your book has gotten, and not taking anything away from your excellent writing style and the brand image of Patagonia. But it strikes me, and I'd like to hear your feedback on whether we're just looking for heroes in our billionaire class at this particular moment of time, and we're just not finding them.
Oh, well, he wasn't a billionaire by the time you wrote the book.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, let me just double click on the title here. Dirtbag Billionaire. Dirtbag, a lot of people see that term and they think, oh, you must not like the guy. I got that question this morning. And I'm quick to add, no. He calls himself a dirtbag. In the climbing world, where he came from, dirtbag is a term of affection, endearment. It means someone who's so unenamored with materialism that they're content to sleep in the dirt if it means they're closer to their next climb, to their next send down a snowy cliff. He was pissed off when he heard the title of the book.
Still is.
Because of the word billionaire. Still is. I know this. Yeah, he loathes being called a billionaire. I'm quick to point out that he gives it away by the end of the subtitle, but didn't fix it. And in fact, I mean, the moment that led to the 2022 transaction when he gave away the company happened in 2017 when Forbes magazine for the first time put Chouinard on their list of annual billionaires. And he said it was the worst day of his life. He was apoplectic. He ran around the office screaming at people. And he said, you got to get me off this list. And it took 5 years, but they finally figured it out. But I do want to address the question directly. I mean, are we just looking for billionaire heroes? I mean, I would contend that the New York Times spends a lot more ink talking about the damage billionaires are doing to society rather than celebrating a few good ones. So my last book was about another billionaire. Jack Welch was a billionaire by being a manager who worked to downsize, outsource, offshore his way to short-term profits. In fact, in the introduction, the first pages of that book, I talk about this very issue. Who do we celebrate in our culture? Who are our heroes? That's what the whole introduction of The Man Who Broke Capitalism is about. And in this book, I recognize, like, this is an unusual story. But what I think you've hopefully heard over the last hour is that it was never the pursuit of becoming a billionaire that motivated Chouinard. It was the pursuit of these other values that were actually in conflict, in tension with becoming a billionaire that led him to do all the things we've been talking about.
Thanks. You spent a lot of time talking about what might be the first 2/3 of the story, but the third third left me hanging a little because there's a lot. Yvon Chouinard set up this amazing perpetuity or this gift to society. And can you give us a little more insight into how they're guiding that and where the money's going and why? And, because it's a really powerful tool. And I'd love to just learn more about the philosophy and the ethos behind that.
Absolutely. I'll do my best. But to reference something I said earlier, Patagonia's like not the most well-managed company at times. Here's the truth. When Chouinard set this thing up and he said, all right, $100 million a year roughly out the door to charity, he staffed that enterprise with exactly one person.
He's a great guy.
He's a great guy. One person. He's busy. And then they're like, what are we going to call it? They're like, okay, we have a name for it. It's the Holdfast Collective. And Greg was like, do I get a website? They're like, no, we're not going to do a website. Like, is there a way to field grant applications? No, there's no way to field grant applications. You just have to figure it out. And so last year, I broke the news in the Times of the first real accounting of where the money had been going. So I got the first report that had been circulated internally, and it showed where roughly $100+ million had gone out in that first year after the Holdfast Collective would set up. And consistency. It went to large-scale land conservation and grassroots environmental activism and a little political giving, because it was set up as a 501c4 to allow them to give politically. As part of the stories I wrote to promote this book, I revisited that. I did a piece in Time magazine about one of the really seminal grants that it's made in the year since I wrote that story, which is about again, large-scale land conservation, but with an edge, with a purpose. So one of the things that they've started to do is identify plots of land that they can acquire that will stop major mining developments. So they did it in Alaska. They bought this piece of property for tens of millions of dollars, and when they bought it, Pebble Mine couldn't be built. And so they're stopping development of pristine lands. They just did it earlier this year in Georgia, the Okefenokee Swamp. Incredible, like, biodiverse region. No one knows about it, but it's like...
I was there last year by coincidence.
Amazing. Paul knows about it. It's a special place.
It is, yeah.
But there was about to be a titanium mine on the edge of it. And even if it was the most responsible titanium mine in the world, it was going to mess stuff up. They knew that. And so Patagonia just helped secure this massive purchase of land that stopped that deal in its tracks. No more mine. And so that's where the money's going. Unlike a lot of foundations which have really embraced transparency, not the case with Patagonia. I'll be trying to find that next annual report, and then I'll report to you. But that's a flavor of where it's going.
If you want to see a part of the world that's different than Marin, I recommend going to northern Florida and southern Georgia around the Okefenokee Swamp. It is much different.
Okay, we have time for one more.
So what happens when Yvon moves on out of this world? I mean, since he's so in focus and control of the company.
We'll start by saying that he's super healthy.
I spent a good amount of time with him for the reporting of this book. He's still a beast. We would spend 10 hours a day in the river. He's 86 years old now. Both spend 10 hours a day? I would often retire early, and he would still be out there. Yeah. He was the first one in the water every day and the last one out. The Snake River in Wyoming, and then some different rivers in Argentina. So I don't get the sense that his body is going to fail him anytime soon, though, God willing, we are all here. God bless. Amazing. I'm looking at my friend Mark Coleman, a Dharma practitioner in the back. So I'm just reminded of impermanence. So let's all take a moment to be grateful, because we're in Marin and we can get weird. That said, this is the $1 billion question. And the practical answer is that the structure is set up for that corporate governance to succeed Yvon himself and even the family itself. The Patagonia Purpose Trust will continue to be stewarded by the family, their friends, other like-minded individuals. Their 2 children are still involved with the sort of stewardship of these organizations. But what happens in the long term, I think, is super unknown. And in fact, when I am asked about the vulnerabilities of this arrangement or the vulnerabilities of the company, I go there pretty fast, because for all of their efforts to find a solution that would ensure the durability of Patagonia as a values-driven business, for all their efforts to sort of create a flow by which the money's going out the door, they succeeded in the short term. But we just don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know when Yvon's gone how people are going to assess the responsibilities and the dueling demands of a business. And in particular, you don't know, I was talking about this on the drive over here, how you're going to be able to incentivize employees at a really complicated moment in corporate America when there's a lot of opportunities. And this is a company that's never going to offer you stock. You're never going to go there to get rich. And what that means, if Patagonia can still inspire the next generation of employees and the next generation of consumers and companies after Yvon Chouinard is gone, we'll see. Yeah.
We'll see. Thank you, David.
If you like conversations with nonfiction authors, check out our America's Book Club podcast. It's a weekly podcast hosted by author and philanthropist David Rubenstein, featuring conversations with leading authors and cultural figures exploring their work. You can find America's Book Club wherever you get podcasts.